Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of my series of how to build a budget gaming PC in mid-2019. In our first video, we picked out all the parts using the buildapcsales subreddit, and we found some really good deals on some parts to build a about $400 gaming PC in mid-2019. And in addition to that, I've got some extra parts like an RX 470 Sapphire Nitro, and that will be a great addition to the Ryzen 2200G system that we spec'd out in our last video. So if you don't know what computer we're building, you can definitely check out the previous video for all the details of that. If not, I do have a PC part picker list of all the parts that we'll be using to build this computer today. And I'm really excited to use this MX330 case, so let's jump into it. Alright, so the first thing we'll be doing, just like we did in our previous video, is getting the processor. So I'll be opening this up. Oh, sweet. Cool. So we've got the Ryzen 3 2200G, which is a great budget option because for about $95 or $80 on sale, you can get some really high clock speeds for Ryzen 2000 series, and you can wait to do a video card upgrade because the Ryzen 2200G has integrated graphics. So this is a good budget starting gaming system, and then when you want to bump it up in performance, this is a good 4-core 4-thread chip that you can drop a graphics card into your system pretty easily. Next up, the motherboard. Oh, sweet. Sweet. It's really exciting. And here we've got the Gigabyte B450M DS3H. This is a really good budget motherboard, budget B450 motherboard that has plenty of connectivity. One of the reasons that I also chose this was the fact that it has 4 RAM slots. So if you so choose, you can upgrade to 32 gigs of RAM later on, which 32 gigs of RAM is a bit overkill, but if you, say, want to do content creation later on, this is a good option because it's got the 2 extra DIMM slots for more RAM. And also in this box came the up here RGB fans. So these are the locked at 1200 RPM RGB fans that only have that outer ring of RGB, so I think this is a really clean, sleek look, and I think it'll look great in our Cougar MX330 case, so I will be saving these for later. Next up, we've got our RAM and solid-state drive. So I've got the Team Group L5 Lite 3D. This is a really good SSD because, first of all, it's 240 gigabytes. Another reason I chose the L5 Lite 3D is because it has DRAM cache, which is really important for the drive that you're installing your operating system on. In addition, I chose the 240 gigabytes because if you get a 120 gigabyte SSD, that is enough to put your operating system and some programs on, but you run out of space really quickly, and I find that in this case, I got this on sale for $28 or $29, so I think that it's definitely worth it to spend an extra 50% to get twice the amount of storage. It's definitely a good value proposition. So 240 gigabytes SSDs are really the future. Next up, we've got the G-Skill Aegis 2800 megahertz CL17 at 1.2 volts, 2x8 gigabytes of RAM. And this will work perfectly with our DS3H because you can drop these in 2 DIMM slots and then have an additional 2 DIMM slots if you want to upgrade to 32 gigs of RAM in the future. Alright, next up we've got the power supply unit. expected. I picked out a pretty standard power supply. We've got the EVGA 450BR, which 450 watts is plenty, and it's bronze rated, and I really like going with EVGA as your brand for your power supply unit because they offer some really good warranties, and generally speaking, EVGA has a very good warranty claim or RMA process if you should have any sort of part fail. So we'll pass that off. And now we get to the really exciting part. Alright, so this is the Cougar MX330 case. This is actually where this whole build started. I was really excited to just get this case because the lowest I've seen it for is $40. At $40, I think this is a really good value. It's got a mesh front panel. It's got 2 USB 2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports. It's got a PSU shroud. It's got plenty of cable management. And it's got 5 slots for fans, which will go perfect with our RGB fans. So I'm really excited to get this opened up, and I'm going to get this opened up off camera because this is huge and I'm in a pretty tight space. Alright, so this is the Cougar MX330. I'm really excited to do that. Alright. And as you can see up here, we've got the 4 ports for USBs, and we've got an acrylic side panel, and of course a PSU shroud, and I'm really excited to start building in this. So let's jump into this build. So first up, we've got the motherboard, which we will get open, and typically a lot of people like to build on top of their motherboard box. So here we've got SATA cable. That's not important right this second. And motherboards come in a plastic wrap. This is a non-conductive wrap so that it doesn't get electrocuted or anything. And let's shut this up. Get that. And now we've got our motherboard on top of our motherboard box. And I'm going to get this open. Drop that on right there. And there we go. Alright, I've got a new camera angle so that I can walk you through how to install the CPU. So I've got the CPU here, and I'll be unboxing this. Let me get this open. Here we've got the chip itself. And the 2200G comes with a CPU fan too. So we'll get that opened up. And one thing to note is that you should not take this out of the box until you're ready to install it. And you need to put the CPU on first. So taking a look at the motherboard, we've got the CPU socket, we've got the RAM slots, and we've got all the I/O panel connectors. And this is where the 24-pin power supply goes in. And we've got a slot for the graphics card. So what we want to focus on right now is the CPU slot. And over here we're going to lift this lever up. And now that we've got the pin ascended, we can open up the CPU, and what you'll see right here is a very small golden triangle on the CPU, and that will correspond with a very small triangle on the CPU slot. So as we can see, this has a small golden triangle in this corner of the CPU, and it aligns with the triangle on the CPU slot on this corner of the CPU slot. I'm going to carefully take out the CPU, and I'm just going to place it in, and that's it. And then you can lock in your CPU by putting the lever back down, and that's it. Your CPU is now installed. Now that you've had the CPU installed, you'll need to grab a screwdriver. Magnetic is preferred, and we're going to unscrew these 4 screws. It's also really helpful to have one of these tins for dropping your screws into, so It's magnetic, and it's really helpful for not losing screws, though it's definitely not necessary in any way, shape, or form. Now that we've got these two pieces off, I'm pulling out the CPU cooler, and make sure not to touch this part because it's got thermal paste on it. And we're going to very carefully drop this on to the screw holes that we just discovered, and make sure you have enough slack to plug in your CPU fan, which is located just near the RAM DIMM slots, right about here. Now that you've placed the CPU cooler on top of the CPU, without screwing it in yet, make sure that your fan plug can reach the CPU fan on the motherboard. In my case, I'm actually going to plug it right in, and it's plugged in, and now I know that it will reach properly. So when you're screwing in your CPU fan, you'll want to tighten about 1 to 2 screws in each corner at a time. So we'll start with this top right corner, and we'll do 1, 2, 3, and then this corner 1, 2, 3. It's not reaching. I'm gonna drop this corner in, and this corner, this corner. And the main thing you want to do is make sure to go from corner to corner, tightening the screws as evenly as possible so that thermal paste doesn't squeeze out the side of the CPU. I actually decided to grab a more heavy-duty screwdriver because that screwdriver is a bit hard to grip, and now I'm making a little bit more progress. Make sure that the connection here is really tight, because the tighter it is, the better CPU performance you'll have, because it'll be able to transfer heat a lot more efficiently. Next up, we've got our RAM, and I'm going to get this opened up. If you look closely on the motherboard, there are DDR4 1, 2, 3, and 4 slots, and in this case, slot 1 is here, and slot 2 is also this lighter gray DIMM slot. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but right about here it tells you exactly what DIMM slot is what number, and it usually goes in a 1, 3, 2, 4 pattern. So I've got channels 1 and 2 opened up. As you'll see, the pins are a bit longer on one side than the other, so this is not exactly halfway through, but it's a little bit further than halfway through. And just make sure that the DIMM slot lines up appropriately. Make sure that these tabs are all the way in and your RAM is all the way seated. And next up, we'll move on to installing this into the case. Alright, so I've got the case up here, and I'm going to take off the acrylic side panel. Straight off. So taking a first look at this case, it looks like we've got all the front panel connectors that drop down behind the motherboard standoffs. And that's a really good thing, because this area back here is perfect for cable management. And eventually we will be taking the back panel off and running all of our cables through there. The first thing you want to do when getting your case open is getting the I/O shield from the motherboard box and opening this up and putting it in to your case. When handling your motherboard, you can pick it up by the CPU core, and that is 100% safe to do so. And what you'll want to do is line up your I/O shield to what slots are open on your motherboard I/O. So this lines up perfectly, and our CPU will be going towards the top, and there's only one way for this to go in. The I/O is over here, and that lines up over here with the case. So we'll be dropping that in after we put the I/O shield in. Okay, now that I've got the I/O shield in, I can get ready to drop the motherboard in. Make sure that cables are out of the way, and in this case I'm gonna shove this through here for now, just to get it out of the way. So there are some extra motherboard standoff screws in the extra supplies that come with the case, which I had to pull off the back panel, and then it was underneath the PSU shroud. And I'm going to open this up. And then this comes a box of screws with 2 extra motherboard standoffs. After you've installed any additional motherboard standoff screws, you can then pick up your motherboard by the CPU fan and line it up with the I/O shield in the back. And we're going to drop this in at a bit of an angle. And then once you've got it lined up, you can start to drop it down slowly. And you'll start to see the motherboard standoff screws. There should be 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can push into the I/O shield just a little bit to line in the motherboard standoff screws. And then the motherboard screws are in the screws that came with the case itself. So make sure to read through the manual to see which screws are specified to go on the motherboard standoffs. So I've got all my screws dumped into my screw holder, my magnetic screw holder, and I'm going to pick out the 6 screws that correspond with the mother M3 for mainboard screws. Once you've found all the screws, grab your magnetic screwdriver and start and push your motherboard in, and then start screwing in. Okay, so next up we'll be flipping this over and coming over to the power supply shroud. And so you've got these screws over here that you can unscrew. Pull these open. And then pull this off. You can just slide it and then pull it up, and off it goes. Here you'll see the back of the motherboard, and you'll see the spot for the power supply unit right here. And here are all the front panel connectors that you should, for now, keep out of the way. And here's where the hard drive bays are, and you also have 2 additional SSD slots right here. So this is where you will mount your 240 gigabyte L5 Lite SSD. So let's get the power supply opened up. And then this is a non-modular power supply, so all of the cords that come out of the power supply or that you'll need are already attached to the power supply. So as you'll see on the bottom of the power supply, there's a fan here, and you'll want this fan on the bottom to push air out through the bottom of the case where there's a mesh panel here. So I'm going to slide this in. And then the 4 screws that came with the power supply, you can use these to screw in the power supply. Now that I've got the power supply unit installed, I'm going to undo the twisty ties on the front panel connectors. And you'll want to save these twisty ties because in the future when you're doing cable management, these might be useful for tying down cables. In addition to that, you'll also get zip ties in your case supplies bag, which comes in this case with 4 zip ties. No pun intended there. So now that you've got your front panel connectors all separated and loose, I'm actually going to switch camera angles and go back to a vertical setup so that we can wire this up. Alright, so I realize that I'm blown out here, but I want to make sure that you're able to see all the connections here. For the front panel switches, we've got the reset switch, the power switch, the LEDs, plus and minus, the HDD LED, plus and minus, we've got USB 3.0, and we've got USB 2.0, and HD audio. So I'm going to start with the easy thing and start from left to right and go with the HD audio. I'm going to continue running it behind the case and running it over to this hole here and pull it through, and what we've got here is HD audio and the front USB, and we can split these and plug them in at the HD audio connector and the USB connector. So I'm going to take care of this. And what you'll notice with the HD audio and the USB 2 is that there's really no way to mess these up. There's only one way to connect them in. They've got 7 pins and there's 1 missing, and you just line it up appropriately. And what you'll also see is that I've split the wires and I ran one through this hole and one through this hole so I could get them as clean as possible. Next up, I've located the USB 3.0 connector, which is this blue connector here, and I'm going to run this through and connect it up. So you'll see on the motherboard it says USB 3.0 right here, and that's where you want to connect it in. So same with the last cords, these only connect one way, and it's pretty difficult to mess up, but be careful because I have heard of people saying that the USB 3.0 connection can be really fragile. And then finally, we've got all the other front panel connectors, which can be really tricky. And I'd recommend that you open up your motherboard manual to see how they're each connected. Alright, so I've never seen that before, but this motherboard did not come with a manual, or at least not from what I could find. And I just printed out a copy of the manual from online, and I just printed out the page for the front panel header connectors, and it's pretty specific about where everything goes. And really, when it comes to this, you just got to do your best. They're pretty durable, so you can plug them in and out a few times if you make any mistakes. And I would just say make sure to follow your motherboard manual as close as possible. It's fairly similar for each motherboard, but you know, you're going to want to have the motherboard manual there to reference. Alright, so one of the other things you should know is that the little triangle on the back of some of the front panel connectors is indicative of positive. So if you don't know which side is positive for, say, the power or the reset button, then the one with the triangle going along the wire is the positive one. So I've got all the front panel connectors hooked in, and quite frankly, this is one of the hardest parts and most annoying parts about building a computer. So you're in the home stretch at this point, and next up we're going to do the power supply cables. So first up we'll get the 24 pin cable, or the 20 plus 4 pin cable, and we're going to run it through up here where the front panel connectors are coming through. And the 24 pin connector is right here on every motherboard, and it's right to the right of the CPU. And again, like most other parts, there's only one way that the 24 pin connector can go in, so make sure that the clip is on the outside. Alright, so I've got the CPU cable coming out here, and if I had planned a little bit better, I may have been able to stick it through this hole up here, but that would require taking the whole motherboard off, and I don't think that it's worth it. So I'm gonna plug this in up here. This is the ATX 12 volt power supply plug, and this is where the CPU power goes. So double check to make sure that your 12 volt pin, your CPU power, is all plugged in. Just, you know, give it a bit of a yank to make sure that it's not going to come out. And I actually ran the rest of the CPU fan behind the case, and I'm going to zip tie that behind the case. That brings us to our final step, where we'll be mounting the SSD on the back, and I'm going to open this up. Once you've got the SSD opened up, make sure to refer back to your case manual and check which screws go along with your SSD, and obviously keep the magnet away from the SSD. So we've got two spots for 2.5 inch drives right here, and we're going to mount the SSD right about here. And before mounting it, make sure to wire it up. So we've got SATA power cables from the power supply unit, and then along with our motherboard we got SATA data cables. And then I've got the SATA power cable plugging in, and I'm going to mount this up right here. Now that I've got this all screwed in, I'm going to run the SATA cable out to the front of the case and into the motherboard, and I'm going to get this plugged in over here on the right side of the motherboard. And it really doesn't matter which SATA slot you put it in, but it's nice to have it in the 0 slot. That being said, I'm plugging into the 3rd spot for cable management. The last thing you need to know when you go to upgrade this computer with a dedicated graphics card, it's really just as simple as using the top PCIe slot, snapping off one of these PCIe covers so that you have room for the ports on the back of the GPU, and then plugging in the PCIe power. And that's really it. You know, it's installing one more part. The only other thing you have to worry about is plugging in all the fans or installing any extra fans that you want. And in my particular case, I've got the up here RGB fans that I'll be replacing this back fan with, and I'll be installing 2 up top and 2 up front. Installation of fans is fairly basic. You know, there's 4 screws, you plug them in, and I will show you the finished product when it's all done. Alright, so I've got everything cleaned up. I've got the up here RGB fans plugged in and installed. I've got 1 in the back, 2 up top, 2 in the front, and this is really what you've been waiting for this entire time. This is all your hard work going into one button press. So this is the moment in time where we see if it posts. I've got the power cable, I've got an HDMI cable running to a monitor just out of frame, and this is it. This is the moment of truth. Yes! This is awesome. This is great. And that's it. Reboot and select proper boot device, or insert boot media in selected boot device and press a key. So that's it. We posted. So from here on out, it is installing Windows with a USB drive, and oh, I completely forgot. I've got the remote for the RGB effect. So pull out the battery protector and let's check this out. Oh, sweet. Oh, this is sick. Oh, this is awesome. I love these things. These things are sick. So I also wanted to see what some RGB RAM would look like, so I'm going to install this XPG Spectrix D41 2x8GB kit and see what this looks like. Alright, so I've got the RGB RAM installed and I want to see what this will look like. There we go. Ah, nice. Wow. This goes really good. This is really solid. I'm really digging this. You can just see those front-facing fans, and you've got these RGB RAM sticks. Oh, this is awesome. I love it. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching part 2 of my How to Build a Budget Gaming PC in mid-2019. I hope you enjoyed the how to build the computer part of this series, and I'm really proud of what I've done today, and I hope that you've learned something, and I hope that you join me in part 3 of this video, and I hope you come along with me for this ride. So please subscribe, and thank you so much for your time today.